வணக்கம். தமிழீழம் ஆய்வானொலி நேயர்களே, மற்றுமொரு மக்கள் கருத்துக்களம் நிகழ்ச்சியில் நாங்கள் உங்களை சந்திக்கின்றோம். இன்று யூகே பாராளுமன்றத்தில் the UK commitment to reconciliation, accountability and human right in Sri Lanka House of Commons வந்து இப்போ டிபேட் ஆரம்பமாக இருக்கின்ற இன்னும் 2 நிமிடத்தில் தட் நாடாளுமன்ற விவாதம் ஐநா தீர்மானம் ஸ்ரீலங்காவை ஐசிசிக்கு கொண்டு போவதற்குரிய அழுத்தத்தை கொடுக்க பிரித்தானியாவில் இந்த விவாதம் வைக்கப்படுகின்றது. இந்த விவாதத்தில் பல பேர் பங்கு பெற்றுகின்றார்கள். அதை நாங்கள் நேரலையாக இங்கே கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். வந்து இதை இணைந்து கொள்ளுங்கள். இந்த விவாதம் இன்னும் ஒரு 2 நிமிடத்தில் ஆரம்பிக்கும்.
Order. Order.
Point of order, Mr. Deputy
Speaker. Owen Thompson.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to make a point of order in relation to the Right Honourable Member for Heltland, Price and Howden and his debate on Tuesday evening this week on the Scottish Civil Service. In the debate, the Right Honourable Member used parliamentary privilege to make a number of points, and privilege obviously allows members to say a number of things, and it remains important when these things are said, what members say is accurate and correct. The Right Honourable Member made 3 specific points that I would contest. Firstly, the Right Honourable Member made reference to a message between specific members of SNP staff where Mr Salmond has claimed there was a conspiracy. It's my clear understanding that the Scottish Parliament Committee has received all of the communications between the named members of staff. Because it has used the powers it has to get them, and the committee has been widely reporting as dismissing them as irrelevant and not showing any form of conspiracy. Secondly, the Right Honourable Member made reference to a message from an individual in HR claiming interference by the First Minister's Chief of Staff, and suggested that this showed the First Minister's Chief of Staff had knowledge of complaints against Mr Salmond earlier than she had said. However, Rape Crisis Scotland yesterday issued a statement from the civil servant involved stating that this was fundamentally untrue and are being deliberately misrepresented, and that they had not shared the details of the complaint or complainer or who was being complained about, and the Chief of Staff's actions were in line with their wishes. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Member claimed that civil servants had deliberately removed a document from the court. This is untrue. Let me quote the Scottish Government statement issued last night. The assertions made by the Right Honourable Member are wrong. This document was not withheld. It was provided to the court on the 21st of November 2018. All that was accidentally redacted was one email address, not a document, and this is clear in the published documents. The Right Honourable Member is right that the Scottish Parliamentary Committee needs to get the truth of this matter, and in order that mistakes are not repeated and that women are not let down in the future. But clearly this will not happen if serious allegations are made without checking the veracity of them first. In response to the Scottish Government's comments last night, the Right Honourable Member appears to have taken to social media this morning to try to move the goalposts, but notably has not sought to defend his earlier accusations. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Member claimed in a newspaper interview yesterday that he was very careful with what he had said in the Chamber on Tuesday evening. However, it would appear that that's not been quite careful enough, and I would seek your advice on what options are available to myself and the member to ensure that the parliamentary record can be corrected.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his point of order and giving the Chair advance notice of that. And I know that he has given advance notice as well to the Right Honourable Davy Davis that he was going to make this point of order. I listened very carefully to what he's had to say, and I'm sure in saying that he believes some of the comments that were made by Davy Davis were untrue, that he is not saying that anybody has deliberately misled the House, and I'm grateful for an acknowledgement of that. It's not for me to comment on the accuracy of comments made by the Right Honourable Member in this adjournment debate or by the Honourable Member either in his point of order. But the Speaker has made it absolutely clear that if any member needs to correct the record, they should do so at the earliest opportunity. The Honourable Gentleman has put his points on the record, and I think we should just leave it there. We now come to the business of the day, which is the backbench business debate on the UK's commitment to reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. And it may be helpful to inform the House that this debate is likely to run until about 3:45. And I call Siobhan McDonough to move.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I begin by thanking the Backbench Committee for approving the debate, and the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton and the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for co-sponsoring it. I proudly declare my interest as the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Tamil Community. For 12 long years since the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, I have stood alongside my Tamil constituents on the road to truth, justice and accountability. 12 years that has presented them with so many challenges, so little progress, and so much pain. The images of those final days of the Civil War are scarred on my memory. No one who saw could possibly forget. The mass violation of human rights left a stain of injustice on Sri Lanka. The world looked away, but today we will not. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I introduce today's debate by running through a decade-long quest for justice. I will continue the last UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka, a resolution the country themselves disappointingly withdrew from, and I will finish by highlighting the urgent need to strengthen the new resolution currently on the table in Geneva. Because the measure of success for global Britain comes not just in rhetoric, but in the actions that we take on the international stage, particularly in the face of international justice. But first, the history. In 2009, in the final few months of Sri Lanka's civil war, tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives. We all remember the horror of the Mullainwakkal massacre, the most recent peak of genocidal killings against the Tamil people committed by the Sri Lankan state. Current Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa was president, and his brother Gotabaya, the current president, was Defence Secretary. They are the present-day link to the atrocities of the past. The bombing of the government-designated no-fire zone where Tamil civilians took refuge is as utterly horrifying today as it was those 12 years ago. As are the big findings of the expert, the government forces even systematically shelled hospitals. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Amnesty International estimates that since the 1980s, there have been at least 60,000 and as many as 100,000 cases of enforced disappearance in Sri Lanka, the vast majority from the Tamil community. These figures illustrate the scale of the suffering, the uncertainty surrounding the facts, and the urgent need for resolution. Members will have heard of the horror of rape, torture, and murder used during the Civil War. Stories of the mass violation of women's rights, stories that brought the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women to urge investigations into sexual violence, stories we could never forget. But to this day, no one has been held accountable for international crimes committed, crimes that have led many to accuse the Sri Lankan government of genocide against the Tamil community. The pursuit of justice must now move decisively forward with more sincerity from the international community. The Human Rights Council meeting happening right now provides the perfect opportunity. Before turning to today's resolution, it is important to consider the resolution that came before. Passed in 2015 with the consensus of Sri Lanka, the previous resolution promised the establishment of a process of justice, accountability, reform and reconciliation. But 6 years on, and Sri Lanka has made clear that it has absolutely no intention of pursuing prosecutions or legal redress for war crimes. Their withdrawal from the process altogether could not have spelt this out more clearly. The little progress made rolled right back. The ongoing Human Rights Council meeting is our chance to finally secure progress, making clear that a country cannot fail to fulfil international commitments. To do so risks undermining the credibility of the Council as a mechanism of accountability. I turn to the current resolution to which the UK is a penholder. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it disappointingly falls short. First, there is no recommendation to pursue criminal accountability by referral to the International Criminal Court. I could barely believe my eyes reading the government's reasoning, citing insufficient Security Council support. Who are we to cast the veto for China or Russia before they have done so themselves? Our role on the international stage must be to send the loudest message that impunity will not be tolerated, not to preempt the inaction of other nations. Second, there is a clear need for an international, impartial and independent mechanism to investigate the most serious international crimes. The Minister may point to Resolution Operative Paragraph 6, but can he confirm whether preparation of files in order to facilitate criminal proceedings will be carried out in accordance with international criminal law standards? The resolution must absolutely clear the requirement to establish triple IM mechanism to investigate allegations of war crimes, secure evidence, identify perpetrators and prosecute those responsible. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights should continue to monitor and report on the human rights in Sri Lanka, providing recommendations to ensure justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators. To rely, as the Foreign Office argues, on the Sri Lankan government to investigate and prosecute all allegations of gross human rights violation is simply unrealistic, falling far short of our moral responsibility. Third, sanctions. Why haven't we applied sanctions against those credibly accused of gross human rights violations? The US has designated General Silva and his immediate family over his role in the extrajudicial killing of Tamils. It's an immediate step we could take, and the Minister cannot point to a veto as an excuse for our inaction. We must ensure a coherent approach to aid, trade, diplomatic and military engagement with Sri Lanka, consistent with the international obligations to human rights. It is long overdue. But it is the present day where I now turn. Mr. Deputy Speaker, human rights are again under attack in Sri Lanka, with President Rajapaksa waging a campaign of war. Many of those who face serious wartime abuse allegations have been appointed to senior government positions. Members of the Rajapaksa family hold nine ministerial roles, including 7 cabinet posts, managing almost a quarter of the budget, its total control. President Rajapaksa even pardoned one of few members of the security forces to be convicted of human rights violations, Saja Sunanul Ratanaka. Unsurprisingly, considering his stated determination to protect so-called war heroes during the presidential campaign. This intimidation is perhaps best symbolised in January's demolition of the Mutlikaval Memorial in Jaffna University. That same month, the High Commissioner for Human Rights' damning report warned that Sri Lanka was on an alarming path towards recurrence of grave human rights violations, calling on the Human Rights Council to take strong action to promote accountability and reconciliation. And it's not just the human rights of Tamils. The Rajapaksa government even insisted on forced cremation for those who had died from coronavirus, disregarding the religious beliefs of the Christians and Muslim communities in the country. The ongoing attacks on human rights is undeniable, and as a penholder to the resolution, the world will watch closely the strength of our response. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I look around the chamber and unless I'm mistaken, I cannot see the Foreign Secretary. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. He repeatedly declined to meet with the APPG for Tamils in the build-up to the Council meeting. Minister, with all due respect, where is he? Under the last Labour government, our Foreign Secretary personally flew to Sri Lanka at the end of the Civil War, pressing for a ceasefire. His absence not only today, but in the months leading up to the Human Rights Council meeting will be felt strongly by the Tamil community. And it is to them that I am turning before concluding. There are 500,000 Tamils across the UK. They are hard-working, respectful and dedicated community who have my utmost respect. We owe a debt of thanks to the huge number of Tamils working tirelessly on the front line of our NHS. I sincerely thank them, and I say loud and clear that however long the road to reconciliation may still be, we will keep fighting for justice and human rights until they are achieved.
The question is, as on the order paper, video link. And 4-minute limit, Elliot Colburn.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thanks also to the Backbench Business Committee for scheduling this debate this afternoon, and indeed to my constituency neighbour, the member for Mitcham and Morden, for opening this afternoon's debate so well. As chair of the APPG for Tamils, and indeed as the largest ethnic minority group in Carshalton and Wallington is Tamil, I'm especially pleased to be speaking in this afternoon's debate to urge the government to do all it can to secure peace and accountability in Sri Lanka. I want to thank colleagues from across the House who've worked with me on the APPG this past year, and to Tamils from Carshalton and Wallington, the United Kingdom and around the world who have been in touch with us and shared their stories. In the short time I've got available to me, which isn't nearly enough to cover everything, I will try to get straight to the point. 6 years ago, it was the UK government who paved the way in addressing human rights abuses in Sri Lanka and successfully pushed for UN resolutions to pursue accountability and reconciliation on the island. UN resolutions that the then Sri Lankan government signed up to. However, sadly, since that time, Sri Lanka have withdrawn their support for these resolutions, and the evidence collected by the APPG from the many evidence sessions we've had this past year have painted a very worrying story of the picture on the ground. As the member for Mitcham and Morden has outlined, recent infringements on human rights have been on the rise. These have included the forced cremations of COVID-19 victims, regardless of their religious beliefs, causing grief and anguish to Sri Lankan Christians, Muslims, and others. The Police Criminal Investigation Department has been repeatedly visiting members of advocacy groups on the island who are campaigning for justice following the disappearance of their family members during the war. The Terrorism Investigation Department has been increasing state surveillance culture, especially in the North Tamil populated part of the island. The state-supported demolition of a Tamil memorial monument at Jaffna University and attempts to prevent Tamil memorial events from taking place at all have been causing anguish amongst the community. Occupying private land in the name of security, and so much more. It is clear that there is no scope at this present time for a domestic accountability mechanism in Sri Lanka, so the UK must once again demonstrate its global leadership on this issue to support an international accountability mechanism. The initial zero draft resolution published by the UK in February and presented to the UNHRC fell well short of providing the action that was needed. I do welcome, after efforts from Tamils in the UK and abroad, campaign groups and indeed the APPG, that following drafts of the resolution have included a requirement to collect evidence on human rights abuses rather than just looking at what is already there, and acknowledge that Tamils for the first time have that Tamils have been particularly victim to worsening human rights abuses on the island. I do welcome these changes, but I urge the SCDO to listen to the calls we are making today. There is so much more that needs to be done, so we must act now before the conclusion of the UNHRC session at the end of the month to ensure that there is a true international accountability mechanism in place. Only then can we hope to bring about truth, justice, reconciliation and accountability for all in Sri Lanka, as well as the Tamil diaspora, not just in Carshalton and Wallington, but across the world.
Video link. Matthew Offord.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can I start by highlighting my chairmanship of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's relationship with the rest of the world has been strongly shaped since the end of the conflict by allegations that the army committed war crimes and crimes against humanity during the final phase of the civil war. A UN panel of experts reported in April 2011 that there were credible allegations of those crimes by both government and Tamil Tiger forces. It remains my opinion that both sides were at fault. However, I do regret the government of Sri Lanka's decision to withdraw support for the UNHCR resolution 30/1 and note that previous domestic initiatives have failed to deliver meaningful accountability. Therefore, I urge the Sri Lankan government to engage in a process that has the confidence of all on the island. But it would be remiss to state that the current Sri Lankan government has failed to act. The Office of Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations are to be retained and strengthened so that communities may build trust. It will be good to see reform of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and progress on the release of political prisoners too. We must act as a critical friend to the country. We need to help to strengthen democratic institutions, and we must trust Sri Lanka to develop their own judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. Since the end of the conflict, reconciliation has occurred between Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslim communities. People are able to live wherever they wish. They benefit from state resources such as free education and health services. Private land that was occupied by the military has been returned, and former conflict areas have been demined with assistance from the United Kingdom. And over 12,000 ex-LTTE cadres have been rehabilitated. And there is a greater connectivity throughout the island and indeed globally, all of which have transformed the business sector and the lives of everyone in the country. But we should remember that resolution and accountability are not a panacea to address underlying tensions. Questions about how to address the legacy of the Sri Lankan conflict, what kind of justice is attainable, how should the victims of violations be treated in the process, what might punishment look like, and how can justice play a constructive role in forging a lasting peace must all be answered. Draft legislation for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been prepared under the previous Sri Lankan government, and this is an area which could be revisited. If it gains universal support in Sri Lanka, then truth-seeking amongst all stakeholders, including the diaspora in many of our communities and constituencies, could make a lasting difference. When these issues have been resolved, then a sustainable and acceptable peace will endure. And given the goodwill between our two countries, the United Kingdom and Sri Lanka, I asked the Minister, how can the UK help to facilitate a TRC mechanism that's unique to the needs of Sri Lanka? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. And it may be for the help of those participating either remotely or physically that the wind-ups will begin no later than 3:21 with Anne McLaughlin with 6 minutes, both Stephen Kinnock and Nigel Adams with 8 minutes, and then back over to Siobhan McDonough for 2 minutes at the very end. I hope that is useful. Video link, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the members for Mitcham and Morden for her warm and powerful opening to this debate, the members for Carl Sholton and Wellington and Kingston and Surbiton for securing this debate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Ambihai Selvakumar, also known lovingly as Ambi, is a director of the International Centre for Prevention of Genocide. Ambi was on hunger strike just recently in Kenton in Brent. She was on a hunger strike in order to highlight the injustices currently in Sri Lanka. Ambi campaign, in her own words, is a demand for justice for the genocide of Tamils carried out by the Sri Lankan state. Ambi's protest sparked a number of solidarity hunger strikes across the northeast. I hope when the Minister gets to his feet that he will address Ambi's 4 demands, which are: 1. Recommend to the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly that Sri Lanka be referred to the International Criminal Court and take steps to effectively investigate charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. 2. Establish an international independent investigative mechanism, IIIM, akin to those established for Syria and Myanmar, which mandates the evidence of international crimes and human rights violations be collected and prepared for criminal prosecutions. She also states that a meaningful independent investigation must also have a strict time frame. And 3, mandate the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights to appoint a special rapporteur to continue to monitor Sri Lanka for ongoing violations and have an on-field presence in Sri Lanka. And the last, Mr. Deputy Speaker, recommend a UN-monitored referendum to determine the aspirations of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka, on the basis that northeast of Sri Lanka is the traditional Tamil homeland and the Tamils have a right to self-determination. I hope that when the Minister gets to his feet that he will address Ambi's demands. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much, Dawn Butler. Video link, Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I declare an interest in October 2020 the British Tamil Conservatives made a donation to the Harlow Constituency Conservative Association. In the final 5 months of the Sri Lankan conflict, it's estimated that between 40,000 and 70,000 civilians were killed. At the end of the war in 2009, some 280,000 Tamils remained incarcerated in barbed wire camps for years, with thousands of enforced or involuntary disappearances. Mr. Deputy Speaker, their relatives continue to search for their whereabouts and for justice. And 12 years on from the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, little progress has been made to secure justice and autonomy for the Tamil community. Still, there is no real accountability. The Sri Lankan state continues to target the Tamil people in all aspects of their lives through surveillance, but by denying them of their livelihoods, physical security, education, economics, culture, healthcare, freedom of expression, and freedom of worship. In February this year, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, issued a report expressing deep concern at the situation in Sri Lanka. And she said, there are clear early warning signs of a deteriorating human rights situation and a significantly heightened risk of future violations. So I ask the Minister, what action is this government taking to prevent future cycles of violence and promote autonomy for the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, as forecasted in this latest report from the United Nations? In 2014, the UK led the international efforts that successfully passed a key resolution in the UN Human Rights Council to promote accountability, justice and reconciliation. In 2015, Sri Lanka agreed to co-sponsor a resolution to promote accountability, justice and reconciliation. But despite this pledge and repeated extensions to their deadlines by the UN Human Rights Council members, successive Sri Lankan governments have delayed and obfuscated at every turn. In 2019, Sri Lanka unilaterally withdrew from the resolution, walking away from its international obligations. The Sri Lankan government has repeatedly reneged on its pledges to investigate and prosecute wartime atrocity crimes. Now is the time for strong international action, led by the UK once again, to secure justice for the Tamil community, recognition of the genocide, and a proper accountability mechanism. In February, tens of thousands of people joined one of the largest rallies in the Tamil homeland since the end of armed conflict in 2009. They marched for 5 days from the east to the north of the island, calling for justice. That same month, 500 British Tamil organisations wrote to our Foreign Secretary seeking an independent mechanism for evidence collection and the referral of Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court. 12 long years have passed. I urge the Minister to listen to the Tamil community here in the UK and in Sri Lanka to recognise the genocide, secure justice for the Tamil community by taking on board the recommendation of the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights and refer Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Video link. Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for leading this debate. I'm proud to have worked with her for many years on the APPG, standing up for justice and human rights for Tamil people. Over those years, we've witnessed time and again the Tamil people being harmed by the Sri Lankan government and let down by the international community. Human rights are again under attack in Sri Lanka. Recent reports from numerous human rights organisations, as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, paint a disturbing picture. From the appalling treatment of Sri Lanka's Muslim and Christian communities during COVID, when the Sri Lankan government for months prevented burials of their dead in the traditional manner, to the continuing human rights abuses against the Tamil population across the island, things are getting worse as the international community wrings its hands. It is clear that domestic mechanisms for accountability in Sri Lanka have failed again in recent years. They just cannot be relied on. An international mechanism has always been needed to enable allegations of genocide, war crimes, and human rights abuses to be properly examined and investigated. Many of us have campaigned for such a mechanism for nearly 12 years since the end of the Civil War. Eventually, the United Nations Human Rights Council for Human Rights, the Sri Lankan government signed up to a mechanism, albeit one involving significant compromise by those of us who felt it didn't go far enough and who didn't trust the Sri Lankan government to deliver. Sadly, time has proven us right. The Sri Lankans didn't deliver on any of the promises made to the international community, and then last March walked away totally. It's clear the Sri Lankan government will just continue to deny, to delay, and to evade. That's why we urgently need a new international solution. The 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council is currently underway, giving the UK the opportunity to demand accountability in Sri Lanka. But regrettably, the draft resolution on Sri Lanka totally fails to rise to the challenge, even though the UK is a leader of the core group. As it stands, the draft resolution is too vague and lacks robust commitment to international accountability mechanisms. Section 6 in the resolution is simply far too weak. That's why Liberal Democrats continue to call on the UK government to work with international partners to ensure a proper international independent investigative mechanism to establish what is happening in Sri Lanka. There must be a robust international mechanism which ensures that evidence can be collected and files can be prepared for prosecution. The British Tamil community is growing frustrated at the lack of meaningful progress in finding justice, and I share this frustration. So it's time for the UK to also undertake bilateral actions to push for accountability. I've long called for an end to arms exports to Sri Lanka. With Sri Lanka listed as a human rights priority country in the Foreign Office's own recent annual human rights report, it's preposterous that arms exports are still not banned. And the government should look at Magnitsky-style sanctions against individuals involved with perpetrating human rights abuses. The truth is, Sri Lanka is part of the global struggle between the US and China. It's part of the geopolitics of our world. And it's time that democratic countries work together to support the democratic and human rights of the Tamil people and stop allowing the Sri Lankan government to become increasingly under the influence of Beijing. It's time we stood up for the human rights of the Tamil people.
Teresa Villiers.
Thank you. I draw attention to my entry on the register of members' interests regarding a visit I made almost exactly a year ago to the UN HRC in Geneva to make the case for justice for the Tamil people. Terrible crimes were committed during the conflict in Sri Lanka. Over a decade later, as we've heard today, human rights abuses against Tamils persist. In a deeply worrying report in January, High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet highlights accelerating militarisation of civilian governmental functions, reversal of important constitutional safeguards, and political obstruction of accountability, exclusionary rhetoric and intimidation of civil society. Mr. Deputy Speaker, domestic initiatives to secure accountability for war crimes have failed to produce results, and Ms Bachelet fears this entrenched impunity could contribute to past crimes being repeated. Not one of the individual cases identified by the UN as emblematic has led to a successful prosecution. In one of the few cases where a member of the military was convicted for murdering a Tamil, President Rajapaksa chose to issue a pardon. Some of those implicated in war crimes have even been appointed to senior positions. Over 40 civil society institutions have reported harassment and surveillance. Reporters Without Borders point to, quotes, an alarming resurgence in attacks on Tamil journalists. The Office of the UN High Commissioner continues to receive credible evidence of abductions, torture and gender-based violence by security forces. The Prevention of Terrorism Act is still used to detain people years after the Sri Lankan state promised to repeal it. driven forward by David Cameron's government after his historic visit to Jaffna, the first by a major world leader, much hope centred on UNHRC resolutions 30/1 and 40/1. That Conservative-led government played a crucial role in securing those very, very significant resolutions. And ministers and officials under this present Conservative government continue to lead efforts to secure a tough new resolution at the HRC session underway as we speak in Geneva. Welcome progress has been made on that resolution, but the international community needs to match words and deeds. If they don't, this new resolution could run into the sand like the previous ones. So I call on the Minister today. It's time for the UK government to use its Magnitsky sanctions regime to target the men the UN believes are culpable for the atrocities that took place during the Sri Lankan Civil War. That is one of the key asks of my British Tamil constituents, and I believe that that could finally help break the deadlock and open the way for justice for Tamils and a better future for Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Much. Tamasheed Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and my gratitude also to the Backbench Business Committee, the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden, and all Honourable Members involved for ensuring time is given to this very important debate. There are many people in my Slough constituency with a direct interest in reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka because of their own links to that nation, because they have friends and family there, or because they are concerned about human rights. I had the pleasure of visiting this beautiful country and therefore appreciate fully the huge potential it has to succeed and prosper on the global stage. However, since the end of the tragic civil war in 2009, there has sadly not been the construction of robust human rights institutions and legal frameworks needed. And attempts at truth and reconciliation have been unsatisfactory, especially the withdrawal by the Sri Lankan government from the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1. There must be commitment on all sides to transparency, honesty and a willingness to show contrition. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Tamil community, victims of violence and their families must feel that their voices are being heard. This has not, sadly, been the case thus far in Sri Lanka. Within the limited time available and without wanting to repeat what other honourable members have mentioned, I want to address one very specific abuse of human rights, an issue of huge concern to Sri Lankan Muslims, Christians and other faith communities, and one which I raised just earlier this month with the Foreign Office Minister, the forced cremation of those who have died from coronavirus. As the House will know, cremation of a human body is forbidden in some religions, including Islam. The Holy Quran sanctifies the human body as made by God and forbids cremation because it contends that human remains must return to the earth. But widespread reports indicate that Sri Lankan authorities have been cremating all COVID-19 victims regardless of religion. The Sri Lankan government's chief epidemiologist claimed that burials would, and I quote, contaminate ground drinking water. There is absolutely no medical or scientific basis for this. The World Health Organization has made it clear that human remains can be safely buried without risk of spreading COVID-19, and across the world, including right here in the UK, countries have safely buried the bodies of those who have tragically died from this virus. And whilst reports indicate that these measures are being reversed, albeit not to full satisfaction yet, this has been seen by many as being in the broader context of oppression of minorities in Sri Lanka, including Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Tamils and others. From listening to constituents, especially those worshipping at the Masjid al-Jannah Slough and the Council of Sri Lankan Muslim Organisations UK, as a Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Sri Lankan Muslims, I appreciate their deep pain and legitimate concerns. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when the war ended, after 25 years of death and destruction, we had hoped for a lasting peace for every citizen of Sri Lanka. We had hoped for the rule of law and universal human rights. recent events show that we still have a long way to go yet, and our UK government must step up to the plate on the international stage and impress upon the Sri Lankan government the need to respect universal human rights and the critical need to follow the path of accountability, justice and reconciliation. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Biddy Link. Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden for leading this debate, and a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Slough, whose remarks I agree with wholeheartedly. I declare my interest as an officer of the all-party parliamentary groups, both for Tamils, Sri Lanka, and chairing that for the Council of Sri Lankan Mosques. Now, the reality is that Sri Lanka was blighted and torn apart by a terrible, bloody civil war. And 12 years on from that ending, there are still many people who are unaccounted for. We don't know what happened to them, whether they were killed, whether they're in graves somewhere, or whether they're dispersed around the world. Now, 9 years ago, I joined with others in visiting Sri Lanka ahead of CHOGM and seeing at first hand the work that was being done in Jaffna. And that heralded the visit then by former Prime Minister David Cameron, which was deeply a historic visit. I saw at first hand the mine clearance that was going on and also the clearance of areas for fishing so that the Tamil people could return to being able to farm and to fish for their own population and for exports. My constituent, Ambahai Selvakumar, has been referred to earlier. She lives in Kenton in Harrow and has been on hunger strike in relation to seeking justice for the Tamil people. I hope her campaign will be successful, but I would caution her to say that her life is more important at the moment than ensuring that we get the British government and others around the world to shift their views. I would commend the report, which highlights the abuses which minority religions in Sri Lanka. Clearly something that we should all draw attention to, and I would commend as well the report by Real Other, who are an organisation that have put together the position in Sri Lanka. They took 32 days, right? It draws not just to the forced cremation issues, but also the other suffering that the Muslim minority are in Sri Lanka right now. Remember, most of the design, there are all sorts of atrocities against the minority Muslims across Sri Lanka. Now, the reality is that there is deeply religious persecution going on in Sri Lanka, where there's a majority, big majority of Buddhists against all the minority religions. I was recently able to lead a virtual delegation to the UN Human Rights Council on behalf of Cosmos and actually draw attention of the Human Rights Council to the atrocities being subjected to the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka. It is key that the resolutions that the Human Rights Council are strengthened. And I would urge my honourable friend, the Minister, when he rises, to give a deep commitment to ensure that we act as a country to strengthen the resolutions and to make people, and particularly the leadership in Sri Lanka, face up to their responsibilities and ensure that religious persecution ends and that indeed their minority rights are protected. After all, that is one of our fundamental areas of international concern, and I hope that we will be leading the way rather than following.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Deputy Speaker, first of all, can I congratulate the Honourable Lady from Mitcham and Morden for setting the scene so well and with such passion as well. We endorse her commitment. I'd like to register an interest as the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief. I'm sure I speak for all members of that APPG when I express that I am very concerned about Sri Lankan government's withdrawal from its commitment to reconciliation, to accountability, to human rights. And I'm also very concerned about the treatment of religious or belief communities within Sri Lanka. The UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, visited Sri Lanka and noted that there were frequent reports of acts of intolerance and the failure of the state to protect individuals and communities targeted by such hostility. Dr. Shahid also said Muslim communities and new Christian churches face a range of harassment and assaults that ranges from interruption, damage to places of worship, physical assaults on clergy, intimidation, mob violence, restricting the use of places of worship, the obstruction of religious rights, incitement to violence, and many, many other acts of intolerance. Indeed, since the beginning of 2015 to the end of June 2019, the National Christian Evangelical Alliance of Sri Lanka has documented an estimated 387 attacks or violations targeting Christians specifically. When it comes to Muslims in Sri Lanka, according to CSW, religious intolerance towards that community predates the 2019 Easter bombings. Many propagators of hate speech towards Muslims play on the economic factors, and anti-Muslim rumours are also a regular feature of life on Sri Lankan social media. Since the bombings, Sri Lankan Muslims have faced an upsurge in violation of their basic rights, as well as assaults and indeed other abuse. And this lack of accountability that abusers and perpetrators of violence face in Sri Lanka is a problem that was raised by many different communities to the Special Rapporteur. The unwillingness of the authorities to protect communities against threats and acts of violence. And we have to address the issue of the legal basis, as the Sri Lankan government constitution declares. Buddhism shall be given the foremost place by the state. And a 2003 Supreme Court ruling determined that the state was constitutionally required to protect only Buddhism. This gross violation of human rights puts into law the government's refusal to treat all religious or belief communities fairly. They should all be treated the same. Sri Lankan state is particularly not responsive to violence and abuse against women. Women's experience of ethnic religious hostility, including the violence, the displacement and the stereotyping, do not receive attention or redress. Women also experience gender-specific hate speech and human rights violations. And moreover, women's human rights activists appear to be at risk from fundamentalist members in their own religious communities. I, as others have said, express some concern over the government forcing cremation upon Muslims and Christians and those of other ethnic groups, and this, I believe, is against the human rights of every one of those different religions, and to be based on absolutely no scientific or medical evidence, I think also gives me great concern. I would like to see that those in position of power are to be made accountable for their war crimes by bringing them to court, take away their assets and their travel bans. And Sri Lanka, with the influence of hate speech, legal discrimination and impunity for violent actors, will only serve to cause more conflict and violence in Sri Lanka in the long run. I always like to leave a scripture text, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I do that in all these debates because it's important to do so. Galatians chapter 6 verses 2, and it says, it urges us, every one of us, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. The people of Sri Lanka, I believe, are crying out for that very help. I urge the Minister, for the sake of every community in Sri Lanka, to use all channels available to him to encourage his Sri Lankan counterparts to commit to UN Human Rights Council resolution of the 30th of March and to the protection of freedom of religion or belief for all. We are here to speak up for those who have no voice. Thank you.
Biddy Link, Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate not just the Honourable Lady for Mitcham and Morden, but a collection of near neighbours of mine to the north for securing this speech. I do, Mr. Deputy Speaker, have a vivid memory of being in Sri Lanka a few years ago as warplanes passed overhead, heading in the direction of the Tamil areas of the country. A very stark reminder of the turmoil that country has experienced. But whilst I'm in no doubt that there was sometimes dreadful deeds on both sides of the civil war, it is the plight of the Tamil community particularly which rightly attracts international concern. And I remember particularly that concern taking David Cameron to Jaffna when he was Prime Minister. It's concern which is rightly shared by politicians across this House today. There can be no winners from the racial strife that continues to dog Sri Lanka today, and nor is it easy to see how that strife can end without accountability for what happened and genuine efforts for reconciliation between the two communities. And I know from my own constituency and the Tamil community that lives and worships here, how strong the sense of resentment and anger still is amongst that community, and also how very real and strong the concerns are for surviving relatives still in Sri Lanka. Many of my constituents lost relatives during the Civil War. Many of them still fear for relatives in today's Sri Lanka, where it's clear that the pressures on the Tamil community have not gone away. It is a tragedy. I also represent a community with members of the Sinhalese community living and working in it, playing an important part, for example, in our NHS. These are communities that should be able, back in Sri Lanka, to find a way of living alongside each other in peace and friendship. But unless that can eventually happen, there will be no long-term stability for the country. So I welcome the UK's move to lead the UNHRC resolution on Sri Lanka. That resolution would provide a framework for continued international engagement on human rights and post-conflict accountability. It calls on the government of Sri Lanka to investigate and prosecute all allegations of gross human rights violations and serious violations of international law, and it highlights concerns about the human rights situation, including particularly concerns about the protection of Tamils. And I'd say today, these are the minimum necessary to start Sri Lanka back on the road to justice and stability. Now, we've heard quite a bit this afternoon about the hunger strike by Mrs. Salva Kumar here in the UK to highlight the need for action on Sri Lanka. But whether or not you support the approach that she took, and I happen to agree with the member for Harrow about the importance of her life, the fact that she chose to do this serves to underline the frustration in the Tamil community about how much still has to be done. And it's my hope, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the Sri Lankan government is listening to this debate, listening to the cross-party contributions, because this is an issue that unites members on all sides of the House. I hope that they will be provoked to think about their future and what's in the interest of their country. Because in the end, no government succeeds by failing to respect the rights of all of its citizens. In the end, the damage to its international reputation feeds through to its economy and to all other aspects of its interaction with the world. So it really is time now for the government in Colombo to act in its national interest, to recognise the deep international concern about what has happened and what is still happening, and once and for all put things right. Because unless there is justice in Sri Lanka for everyone, and justice for all those members of the Tamil community, that potentially great country will never in reality be able to fulfil its potential. And I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, without justice, its reputation in the world will remain seriously tarnished. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam Tarrant.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend Mitchell Morden for securing this important debate, important to so many people in Ilford, both north and south. 12 years we now are, Mr. Speaker, after the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, and the latest UN report on the country's human rights situation paints an extremely worrying picture. Since 2019, the situation in Sri Lanka has rapidly deteriorated. Widespread reports of torture and oppression, the reintroduction of the death penalty for certain drug offences, antagonistic behaviour such as demolition